Okay, so last time we left off, we'd created a door. We have some sort of a pressure plate that lets you open the door, and we have a player that can run around. I've tweaked my scene slightly, so I've only got the one pressure plate now, and I still can't quite make it through the door. So what we're going to work on next is making our door interactable by the player, not just from pressure plates. Now, there's a couple of tricks that we're going to use for this. We're going to have to find some way of having the player talk to the door. The way I've chosen to go about this is with our Interactable Interface. We've seen it briefly in the past. We'll dive into it deeper in a second. But first, I want you to go into your project settings. If you haven't already done this, come into your 3D physics, and we want to set up a layer for interactable things. You may have seen this in one of the earlier videos, so you might already have it, but if you haven't, this is where we set it. So our default layer, everything's on that by default. This is what's going to stop you walking through things. If you collide with something on the default layer, it'll just stop you. Our interactable layer probably won't ever do any collisions. We'll just use it to figure out what you can interact with. Things can be on multiple layers, so they can be on both. So the first thing we're going to need is something on the character that makes it look in front as you go around. If we have a look at my original character here, we have our head, we have our pointer, which we don't care about. It's pointless. Haven't used that joke before. Here's our camera. And then under our camera, we'll ignore the attachment point for now. We have a Raycast. It shoots directly forwards and it collides with just stuff on the interactable layer. So it won't trigger when it smashes up against a solid brick wall, but it will trigger when it hits the door. So we're going to add one of those to our character. Under our head here, we're going to have a Raycast. There's a few things that are really important here. First up is our cast 2. The Raycast is like a laser shooting off, but it has a set distance it goes. So I guess it's more like a lightsaber. Currently it's moving down 1 unit, so it's looking straight down inside us. We don't need that looking at our feet internally. So we'll go 0 on the Y, and we want to go -Z because that's the direction our camera is facing. That is into the screen. So you can go any number. You can go 5. That's a fair way in front of you. I think last time I used 3, so let's do the same here. We will look 3 units in front of us. Next up, our collision mask. Like I said before, we don't want to collide with default. We want to collide with interactable stuff. Then we do have this collide with, so that you can decide whether to collide with areas or bodies. I'm only colliding with bodies, specifically the door or the cube that we can pick up and throw around later. But if you want to collide with areas, you can enable that here. The other important one, I guess, is Exclude Parent, which is set on by default. So by default, we won't collide with ourselves. That seems like a good idea. And then the most important setting, and I don't know why it's off by default, is enabled. The Raycast does nothing until it's enabled. I think in the later versions of Godot, we're going to have it enabled by default, but I don't know if that's a Godot 4 or a 3 point something in the future option. But as long as you manually enable it, you'll be fine. So, next things we want, we're going to start messing with our script. And again, I'm going to just copy stuff across from my original character script, because that's the easy way. So we have our camera and stuff set up. We need a Raycast. Let's bring that across. We'll chuck it under our camera. Now you could do an export node path for this, and you probably should, but I went the lazy way. And I just straight use the name of the node, which means if you've renamed this from Raycast to something else, or if it's not under the camera, like in my case right here, it's not going to work. So I'm going to reparent this to my camera. I'm going to leave it named Raycast. So now that we've got our Raycast, we're going to need to track the thing that we're trying to interact with. And we're going to use a little signal because we'll have some UI stuff later. I will chuck these above the movement. Let's keep them where they are in my other project. So the current interactable thing will be what we're currently looking at, what our ray is hitting right now. This signal is a method that can be emitted. It's just like a normal signal in GD script, and when we emit it, we will send out one argument, which is the thing that we're interacting with. So the next thing is, in our physics process, we want to figure out what we're looking at. So we'll grab this, slap it in there. Every physics tick, probably 60 frames a second. If you don't know about this, go back to the character video and rewatch the bit where we explain it. We are going to see what our ray is currently colliding with. Get collider will return the first thing that your ray is smashing up against. We'll then check to see if it's the same thing as it smashed up against last frame. If they're different, we're going to log whatever it is that you're currently smashing against, and we will emit our signal telling people, here's the thing that we're currently looking at. Now, name of might be something you haven't seen before. The reason I'm doing that is because emit signal here takes a string with the name of the signal that we're emitting. So I could, instead of doing this name of it would be the name of the thing, right? Oh god, I'm so good at writing code. Now the reason I'm using name of is because if I were to rename this to blah, this would update, this would not update, and suddenly I would no longer be emitting my signal. The name of just returns a string that is exactly the same as the actual variable that it's referencing. So this will always say the same as this. If I update this using F2 to rename, by the way, my refactoring will go, oh, that's a reference to that method. We'll update it. All of my code will continue to work. I'm a big fan of nameof. It's one of my top reasons for using C# over GD script. So every physics tick, we will figure out what we're looking at. We will tell people if what we're looking at has changed since the last frame. So there's one more piece that we need to grab, and that's actually doing something when you press the interact button. So in process input, and this is where my movement region is kind of a lie, so I'm going to remove that region. At the end of process input, we handle our movement input, then we do our escape button. Now we're also going to check if our Raycast is currently colliding with something and you've just pressed the interact button. Now our interact we wouldn't have had set up before, so if you come into your input mapping here, create one called interact and assign some buttons to it. This could be E as well as say X on a PlayStation controller. You can set up multiple mappings in here. So when you've just pressed the interact and we're looking at something, then we will grab the thing that we're looking at and we will try to cast it into our Interactable Interface. If it doesn't implement Interactable, and if we look at our door, Activatable, not Interactable, this will return a null. Interactable will be equal to null. We won't do anything more. But if the thing that we are colliding with is interactable, we will call the canInteract method on it and we'll pass ourselves in. So I guess it's time we have a look at what Interactable does. We've got a couple of methods. We have canInteract, where you get past the thing that wants to interact with you, and then we have interact, which also gets told what's trying to interact with you. So let's say our door were to implement Interactable. canInteract will be called with the person trying to open the door. So you could then check whether they are identified. Maybe you've got, a optical scan or something built into your door. You can tell whether that person should be allowed through. And then after you've either said yes or no, we have the interact call. So the way that I'm setting this up in the character script, we do a canInteract. So the player asks the door, in this case Interactable is the door, can I, the player, interact with you? If the door says yes, then we call the interact method on the door, saying, hey, this is the player interacting with you. So that's the point where we actually try to open the door. The other thing that is returned in Interactable, it's an interaction text. We have to have a property that can be read with interaction text on it. So let's update our door to implement Interactable. Easiest way, we add it to our list of things we implement. It goes bright red. We click the little icon here, say implement. It'll add stuff in. So it will create our interaction text, which is just going to be an explosion if anyone tries to read it. On our door, it's going to be open. If you look at the door, it will say you can open this. That'll be the text that will display to the player. Now I'm going to go to my normal door and steal the rest of the code for this because there's not much, but here's our Interactable Logic. We don't have Interactable. It's a boolean up here and it's an exported one. Now up here, let's put it under our other export variable, I suppose. Actually, we'll go under, because I like to have my node path and the node path thing next to each other. So Interactable, it is a single flag for can the player interact with this door. By default, we're going to say it is not interactable. All the doors in the game cannot be opened by the player by default. And we can change this because it's an export variable. We can change it on individual doors to make them openable. So that way, when we add a door, it's kind of locked by default and then we can make it open easily. Or you can leave it like that and maybe you unlock it in future by activating it from a remote computer console or something. That way we can tie our activatable and our interactables together. So we have whether it's interactable or not. The player can interact with it if that flag has been turned on in the editor and the door is not currently open, so you can never close a door as the player, and the caller is a character. Now I'm going to have to change this to a character 2 because I have a character 2 class. That's what we've been working on. This will just match whatever your class name is. And then when we interact here, really, we don't have to do anything. We can just call our own activate method. It already has logic for playing our animation when you want to activate. So that's kind of cool. When the player interacts with the door, it does the exact same thing as when the pressure plate interacts with the door, which is just to open the door. Nice and easy. Let's jump back over and make sure we've got all of our nodes set up correct. So our door, wherever that is, tutorial door 2. Our door needs to be on the interactable layer. We set this up last time, but in case you forgot, the door needs to be on interactable for the player's Raycast to reach it. So, completely untested, trialing live, and we'll just see if I can walk up to the door and have it open. So if I dodge around the pressure plate that's there, press E, nothing happens. Well, that's a bit disappointing. So let's start figuring out how to debug what went wrong. Now the easiest option for now, I'm just going to quickly comment out this. Well, if I could type correctly and press shift at the right time. So if we've just pressed interact, then we'll do stuff. We're not going to do the colliding check. And then I can do some logic. I can gd.print. In this case, let's print camera raycast.is colliding. If we jump back, we'll run our project again. I'm just going to move this window so it's over top so you can see my output down here. So if I press E, we're not colliding. If I run up to the door, I'm not colliding. So something is stopping my Raycast from getting out. My door 2. Maybe we'll turn on the mask here. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so we'll fire this up again and we'll just have another try. Move my screen. So we run up to it. I'm not colliding. So what I think the issue was that my collision box was so big that when I was walking up and trying to activate, I was actually standing inside the collision box when I attempted to activate. So all I did was collapse this right down so it's in line with my door. So the collision shape actually lines up with the door, which is a sensible thing to do anyway. So my test map here, I'm also going to grab the pressure plate and I'm going to slide it way back so that it doesn't confuse us. Move my screen across. So again, if I press E, you'll see coming up false because I'm nowhere near the door. If I'm close to the door, 3 meters away from the door, I can start saying true. It's colliding. So let's go change our script. We no longer want to see if we're colliding with something. We know we are colliding with something. Let's change our logging here to print out the thing that we've collided with. Or it'll be a null if the thing that we're colliding with can't be interacted with. So we walk up, I get static body 1247. So that's perfect. That means that I am colliding with the static body of the door. Next, let's ask gd.print whether I'm allowed to interact with it. Let's check that logic. Now this I expect will be false, and actually this will be a part of what caught us out. So we're going through the very, see, this is returning false because I'm not allowed to open the door. The reason for that is because is interactable defaults to not being on. So let's turn that on and we'll try again. So this time we walk up to the door, press E. I am allowed to interact and the door opened. Brilliant. Let's jump back into code. We'll remove our little debug there. So there's sort of the shotgun debug approach, sticking print statements everywhere to try and figure out what's going on. So I guess we could stop there. We've got a character that can interact with things. You just don't know when you can interact with things or what things you can interact with. So if we jump back to my original character, this is where the Interactable Ui comes in. So our Interactable UI is a canvas layer, and under it is a text label. Text label is just in the middle of the screen. If you scroll out here, the blue outline is the entirety of your screen. And our label in here is going to stick some text in roughly the middle of our screen, right? So let's create something similar in our new character. We will add a canvas layer. So a canvas layer is just something that can be drawn on. And then under this, we'll have a rich text label. So this jumps us over into that editing screen, where you can see that if this is a full screen, our label is going to be up the top. Let's change our text here to be open, because that's what we're expecting our text to be. And you can see it's tiny wee text in the top left-hand corner. There are some automatic layout things. Honestly, I'm not going to cover UI too much, but these can let you pin stuff to different parts of the screen. We're just going to pin it to the center. And it looks quite small by default. When you're zoomed out like this, it looks tiny. When you come in a bit, it's maybe not too bad. We can give it a go. If we load up our problem scene again, we now have a UI glued to our screen all the time. That open text is, it's probably a bit small, isn't it? So we'll come to our label. Font stuff is rather annoying. I have downloaded the Roboto Fonts. I just googled Roboto font. You can grab whatever font you want though. You can download these and then we can load them into Godot. So if you download the family, it will download a zip file. Drop these into your project folder, which I've already done. So in my project folder, I have a UI font, and that has those TTF files. We can then create a theme, which lets you theme all of your UI options, but I'm going to avoid UI stuff because I don't really know it all that well yet. So we need to create a default font. We don't want a bitmap one, we want a dynamic font. And then in here, you can load your font from those files. So UI fonts, let's go with, we'll go with a medium italic. Why not? So in my, you can see my font here. It's quite hard to see with everything surrounding it, but it now has italics. If I expand this down, there are more settings I can do. I can scale up my size. Let's go for 36. You'll see that at 36, my little container here, pretty blimmin' small, missing half my letters. We can just expand this out to be whatever size we want, really. Let's make it, say, this big. So our text would be slightly offset. Because we're using a rich text label, we can use BB code, which allows you to do things like center, hello, which would put your text in the center. Alternatively, you continue to use the normal text, which is probably a bit simpler. Just say open. We'll just resize our container to be somewhere where we want. We can be a bit above the center point of the screen. So if you've got some sort of cursor in the center of the screen, we're not going to block it. We'll be slightly above it. And we'll leave it at this for now. I'm not a big fan of the UI stuff. I don't know it well enough. I think Heartbeast has some tutorials. I might have to go and watch those. So we have our, let's call this UI. And we have a label under it where we can put some text. If we look at our original character, we have an interactable UI and a label. That interactable UI has a script that points to it. So let's go and add a script to our UI. And then we'll steal some code. So this one is going to be tutorial UI C# script create. So we've got our simple thing. We'll get rid of these ones. And I will pull up my existing code. And we'll just copy this across. Might as well copy everything. And we'll just go through it one step at a time. So, as always, we have an export variable. It exports out a node path. Our node path tells us where to find the interaction label. And then in our ready, we're going to grab our rich text label from that node path, stick it into our interaction label. Now, the next bit of craziness. getParent goes one step up the tree. So if we have a look, getParent here is going to reach up to character 2. We then connect. Connect lets you connect a signal to a method. So in this case, we go to the character. And again, I'm using the name of to figure out the name of the interactable updated, which was the signal in our character script. In this case, I don't want a character. I want a character 2. That's just because my project is copying and pasting stuff around. So we go to character 2, which has an interactable updated signal, and we connect ourselves. Connect takes the name of the signal you are connecting to, the class that has the method that should be called, in which case it's us, it's the UI, and then the name of the method on the UI that should be called. So we want to do an interactable updated callback. So I'm doing this from code, mostly to show you that you can connect signals from code. The other thing we could do is come into here. On our character, we could go to that signal and we could connect it to our UI. And if we jump back, we would use the name of this method and we would plug it right there, connect. That would get you the exact same effect. So when the character emits this interactable updated, a UI would be updated. I'm just showing that you can do things in different ways. Whether it's better to do it through code or not, I don't know. I guess it's quite clean that you can see the signal symbol up here. So maybe it's better to set it up in the nodes. But we'll set it up in code just because we can. So when that signal is called, we will get handed the interactable object that the character is now looking at. We have an interactable variable here to try and cast it into iInteractable. So we make sure that it's an interactable. If it's not an interactable, so it couldn't be cast, therefore it's null, we're going to set our text to nothing. Or if it could be cast to an interactable, but the thing we're attached to, remember this is a child of the character, so our character is not allowed to interact, in which case we'll just leave our text as nothing. But if the player is allowed to interact, then we can grab that interaction text and we'll update our interaction label. We can just set the text property, which is exactly the same, and you can tell by going up here, hovering over this text here, tells you the property is named text. So we've now got a very simple UI script. It will connect up the signals for us, and when our player walks up to the door here, it should get the option to open. And we exploded. Why did we explode? I know it's because I didn't set up the node path, but we can see here, the instance of type node path is null. That means you haven't set a node path. So in our character here on the UI script, we need to set a node path to our text label. Now we can launch our problem scene again. And here we go. If we walk up to the door, it says open. If I'm not looking at the door, but standing next to it, it doesn't say open. If I look at the door, it says open. And if I interact with the door opens and the label goes away. There we go. We have an interaction system. You can walk up to a door, you can interact with it, you can go through it. I'd call that a success. Now, obviously, we're only using a door in this example, and that's a bit boring. So, I'm not going to walk through step by step, but we can create other things, right? There's this pedestal thing here. What on earth is a pedestal? A pedestal is a static body that exists on both the default and interactable layer, because I don't want you to be able to walk through a pedestal, so it needs to be on default to stop you walking through it. And the interactable layer, I'm facing somewhere weird, so I can hit F to find it. In addition to being a static body with our stuff, we obviously need to have a collision shape, because static bodies need it, so its shape just matches up. And then it's got a bit of UI, it's got a static. In this case, instead of a mesh instance, I used a CSG box. I think that's because originally I was going to make a funky shape out of it, and then when I started working with the material, I found that a plain box looked better. You could do like a box with the torus halfway through, or cut out of it, so it's a box with a bunch of holes in it or something. But it looked cleaner just being a plain old box. If we look at this pedestal script, it implements iInteractable, because the player can interact with it. It has interaction text of activate, because you can activate a pedestal. If you haven't already pressed it, then we can call the activate method when it's interacted with. We can change our color, and our can interact is if we've not already been pressed and you're a character. So this logic's very, very similar to the doors is open and you're a character. It has different text, and it does some slightly more interesting things when we interact with it. But conceptually, it's the exact same as what we've just created for the door. So we've now got pressure plates and doors and stuff, but the next thing we'll create is going to be one of these cool little cubes, something that you can pick up, move around, and throw. I think that adds a little bit of interest, something kind of cool that we haven't played with yet. You can bounce it along walls, throw it over doors. We might also create the pedestal, because that's kind of useful. And look at that. Once we have our cube set up, we'll be able to start doing puzzles where you have to throw something onto a panel in order to open doors so that you can continue. And then once we've got all of that working, we could have some sort of way of ending the game. So tune in next time to see all of that stuff.